thank you all for being here.
Yes, thanks very much. It's inspirational to see so many people from particularly familiar faces. Thank you.
And history matters.
It should.
Both the making of history, the recording and documenting of history, and the analysis of history, all of which we will get to, because all of which make up part of a book I hope you've all bought and read. There will be a quiz at the end of this hour, or more likely a book sale at the end of the hour, but really a terrific contribution, and I found it very valuable. You can't hear me. No one ever says that, but okay, thank you. I will hold this closer to my lips, and hopefully we won't buzz. Tim, this book focuses intently on two events about 3.5 years apart, and yet it also dives deeply into understanding a broader phenomenon in American democracy as we get close to our semi-quincentennial 250th anniversary of independence. To help us appreciate the scope of the work here, perhaps I can ask you to start by providing the arc of the overall argument of the book as a summary, and then we can dive into the details.
Sure, happy to. Ian, thank you. The book tries to draw connections between what happened in August of 2017 in Charlottesville to what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, 2021. I have this sort of unique vantage point of deep familiarity with both, and they're related, and there are things about them that are revelatory about kind of where we are as a democracy. So the idea behind the book was to start with what the events have in common, what are the common contexts in which those events occurred, and then kind of zoom out from there to derive some broader lessons about where we are as a democracy. And then sort of my own thoughts at the end about ways to fix that. I didn't want to just sort of write this prescription of doom as to where we stand without offering some hope and some practical advice for people who want to be part of the solution to ensure that democracy is maintained. So it's sort of what happened, what they have in common, what they reveal about the state of democracy, and then some recommendations at the end about what we can do to fix that problem.
So in the book, you talk about how you were not actually in Charlottesville on August 11th and 12th. You had to be in Washington. You had been some of the lead-up events. Yeah. So it was on your mind very much. You were aware it was happening, but you had to be out of Washington. And you describe that the morning after the rally, you were having breakfast with your wife's family and your father-in-law, a retired military general, and he said something that got you thinking, and I think may have started off this process here. What did he say, and what did it mean for you?
Yeah, I was at my in-laws' house. I'm really privileged to be married to Lori Shinseki, and her father, Eric Shinseki, was Army Chief of Staff for 4 years, and then was Secretary of the Veterans Administration in the Obama administration. And he's a person that I've respect and have learned a lot from over the years. I was sitting literally at the breakfast table on August 13th, and he said, well, surely there'll be some kind of after action after a debacle like this. And he proceeded to tell me that in the military, regardless of success or lack thereof, after every engagement, there's a very thoughtful process to evaluate what went right and what went wrong. And I said, well, I hope so. That makes sense. We certainly should take some time to figure out what happened. And I'd like to do that. You couldn't help, all of you who lived in this community at that time, I felt this immediate sense of both sort of outrage and desire to do something in the wake of it to heal, or to understand first and then heal. So I raised my hand, and I literally reached out to the then mayor and the city council and the city manager, who I had known from having served as U.S. attorney in this community, and said, are you going to do an after action? If so, this is what I do now as a lawyer. I'd be glad to do it. And
were they thinking about one at the time?
I don't think so, candidly. I mean, it was literally like a couple of days later, and I think they were still reeling from what had occurred. I mean, the idea resonated. I think it pretty quickly became clear that they needed to do something. Then the question was who would do it and what form it would take. And I literally sketched out sort of how I would approach it and a plan for it, and I was really fortunate that the city hired me and the law firm for which I then worked to do an independent review. And it was really crucial that it be independent. One of the conditions that I felt strongly about was I didn't want to be used as sort of a pawn to tell a preconceived narrative. I wanted the freedom to be able to access whatever information I thought was relevant and to tell an objective story about what occurred without filter or redaction or having it screened. And Maurice Jones, who was the city manager, gave me that assurance, and he was true to his word. Like, I literally got access to everything I asked for, even though there was some resistance, which we can talk about. And my report was printed, was made public without any filter or redaction. It was very critical of my own client.
So you've lived in Charlottesville on and off for more than 40 years. I apologize. If I get too loud, please let me know. You've lived in Charlottesville on and off for more than 40 years at this point, not to age you. And yet you state in the book that you didn't really begin to understand the community and all its contradictions until about 8 years ago. How did your service leading the independent review shape how you understand the city in which you live?
Yeah, so I write about this in chapter 1 of the book. My own education about Charlottesville that ensued from the work I did on the independent review. So, I went into that thinking that this was an idyllic place to live, full of natural beauty and broad opportunity. I raised my family here, and I sort of saw the sunny side of the street. And I was really surprised at the way in which the city really kind of failed, candidly, on August the 12th. As I got immersed in the review and talked to lots of people in the community, I learned that that's not true for everyone, that there's another side of the street where people's experience was very different, where this isn't an idyllic place full of opportunity, but a difficult place to live and with a difficult history. And they weren't surprised at the failures of the city. They had a lived experience that brought forth, frankly, a lack of surprise about law enforcement not being there to protect and serve, and city council not really prioritizing the right things. So as I learned about people's varying perspectives about Charlottesville, it opened my eyes to a lot of things about this community. Frankly, some division that ripped the lid off for me, and I think for a lot of other people, which can be positive and healthy if some of that stuff is out in the open and we can talk about it. But it certainly was revelatory to me.
Were there other surprises for you? I mean, you, as a U.S. attorney, you've done lots of investigations for private clients, you did internal investigations, but you'd never done something quite like this.
Yeah, there were a lot of surprises. There were surprises in the facts, and then there were surprises in the reaction to our work. With respect to the facts, any investigation starts with a hypothesis against which you sort of test the evidence. And my initial hypothesis was this was a big surprise that overwhelmed authorities. That just wasn't true, right? This was not an intelligence failure. There was ample information in advance that suggested that people were coming here to provoke and engage in violence, yet law enforcement did not accurately operationalize that intelligence. That was a surprise to me. The mismanagement of the event was a surprise to me. And then in the reaction, I was very surprised. I expected that as the hypothesis filled out, that most of the criticism I would get would be from law enforcement, because I was really critical of not men and women on the line, they were frustrated, but with police planners. And I call out, the state police for not cooperating. And I thought, I'm making enemies on the law enforcement side of this. Not at all. The vast majority of the men and women in uniform with whom I spoke appreciated it and wanted that kind of candid assessment to help them get better. I thought that sort of progressive, anti-racist communities would be pleased that I was critical of the city and critical of law enforcement. Quite the opposite. I had a lot of criticism, frankly, from people in this community who thought that the report didn't more aggressively blame the racists or sort of call out historic systemic racism. And my response to that was, the scope of my review was much more on sort of the tactical management. It wasn't to make a moral judgment or to sketch out the history of racism in Charlottesville, which is obviously worthy of discussion and consideration, but it was a bit beyond my scope. And the resistance to me and the fact-gathering process from people in that sort of progressive anti-racist community surprised me. I thought they would be more receptive to cooperating. They didn't trust me, they didn't trust the city. So that was harder in terms of a source of information.
In fact, lack of trust is one of the themes that comes across in the book.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, lack of trust in institutions is kind of the theme of the book, and one of the things that ties together Charlottesville and January 6th. And I found a lot of mistrust of institutions in Charlottesville, a lot of people that didn't think that this was a benign process designed to get to the truth. They assumed that it was going to be a whitewash or going to be yet another politicized process that would not ultimately get to the truth or serve any useful purpose, and didn't think that law enforcement really wanted to learn and get better. And that palpable distrust was a resistance to the process in terms of fact gathering, and was a real important sort of lesson for my own learning.
In the book, you mentioned that in every investigation, there are things left undone, but that you're able to capture the core story. Looking back now a few years later, is there anything you might have wanted to do differently, or any threads you want to go back and reopen?
Well, in Charlottesville, I was shocked at the lack of cooperation from the state police, from the state government, from official channels that I assumed would be interested in an honest reckoning as to what happened. So I don't know that I could have done it any differently. I had to literally file like FOIA requests with the state police to try to get documents from them. They wouldn't give them to me otherwise. So that is something undone. Thankfully, the state police left behind in a staging area with a field force their operational plan. So we had it, even though they didn't give it to me. Yeah, exactly. Their carelessness, frankly. And there were some state police troopers who were frustrated, who spoke up, thankfully. Similarly with the sort of Antifa and progressive communities, officially, I got letters from the National Lawyers Guild and others saying, we're just not going to cooperate with you. But there were enough voices within those communities that were willing to speak up that I feel like I was able to get core, important parts of the story and important perspectives. But I wish that I'd had a little bit more sort of fulsome cooperation from those sources. But I can't say that in either report, either Charlottesville or Jan 6, there's like a big hole or a big thing left undone. Despite the resistance, I feel like we were able to, tell the core story that I think has stood up and will stand up to the scrutiny of time.
Great. So let's jump ahead now to January 6, 2021. We were still in the midst of COVID. Where were you on January 6th, and when did you learn about what was happening at the Capitol?
So I was in Madison Hall in my office at UVA. I was the university's general counsel, and I was, like everybody else, watching it on television, horrified. And it was immediately apparent to me, Ian, that it felt a lot like August 12th, like passive police response to overwhelming violence, horrific images of violence, and a similar looking crowd of people that were causing that violence. So I kind of immediately thought, this looks familiar, or there are likely to be parallels. And much like after August 12th, I immediately felt this kind of desire to be part of the solution, and thought there would, just like August 12th, thought there might be some sort of process at some point, and sure
One
enough,
of the after-action review.
Yeah, I again, raised my hand for this. When the select committee was formed, a law school classmate of mine, Sean Patrick Maloney, was in the House Democratic leadership, and he connected me to the speaker, and the speaker connected me to her team, and I interviewed for the position of running the investigation with Charlottesville kind of as my resume for that. I had done this work similarly before, and that's what informed the decision to hire me to lead the Jan 6.
So tell us about that role as lead investigator. What does that look like?
Yeah, really different. So a lot more resources. We had subpoena power. We had a lot. It was more official than Charlottesville. But the first task with any investigation, I was talking about hypothesis. The other important thing is scope, and the enabling legislation that created the select committee was just not very helpful there. It basically created a select committee to evaluate the facts and circumstances that gave rise to the attack on the Capitol. Not any real line from what happened at the Capitol itself between officers and rioters to what's going on in this country more broadly with domestic violent extremism. And so we had to come up with some kind of plan that defined our scope. That was the first task, because I went in kind of with a proposal of these 5 overlapping teams, these color-coded teams, each of which would have a subject matter within the overall investigation that were related but distinct enough that they justified their own focus. So we had the blue and the red teams that were focused on either side of the fence. The blue team was focused on law enforcement, military, intelligence gathering, and management of the event. The red team, named for the sort of MAGA caps that were ubiquitous in the crowd, they were focused on the rioters. How much organization, coordination was there between them? How did they come together? And then zooming out from the Capitol, we had the gold and the purple teams. The gold team was focused on the election fraud narrative and all of the political machinations that went into the fake elector certificates and pressure on state officials and the vice president, the whole election fraud narrative. And then purple was domestic violent extremism writ large. There were a lot of occupations of state capitals and other events that sort of led to the attack on the Capitol, and purple focused on that. And then the green team was focused on funding streams, like who was paying for all of this. And each of those teams, we'd meet every Monday morning, the leader of each team.
How much staff was there on each of these teams?
There were 4 or 5 lawyers or subject matter experts on each team, all of whom I hired. I mean, these were seasoned investigators that had done a lot of, mostly in the criminal justice world, had done a lot of investigative work before. But it was essential that we worked together, and we kind of continually evaluated our scope and whether it was appropriate, needed to be broadened or narrowed.
Most were former prosecutors or current prosecutors?
Yeah, I think of the 25 lawyers, 14 were former prosecutors, which is, the House Republicans criticized this as well. It's evidence that this was clearly a predetermined narrative to point the finger at, at the then former president. Not at all. I hired people that had the requisite experience and skill set to do this work, to interview people, to distill what's relevant from large amounts of information, documents and video, and to be able to translate findings in a persuasive way. I mean, that's the stuff that you do when you're an assistant U.S. attorney or a public defender, not so much as a congressional investigator or a lawyer in private practice.
And what was the political dynamic on the committee?
People ask me that, and I got to say I don't know what everybody's affiliation was. I mean, that was not a consideration for me. There were 2 Republican members of the committee, each of whom had a couple of lawyers that they hired. So Ms. Cheney had a couple of lawyers, and Mr. Kinzinger had 1. And I assumed that they were Republican. I know one of them was a former Republican U.S. attorney. But when I hired people, I didn't ask them, who you voted for or what are your politics. I wanted, tell me about your experience, what'd you do as an AUSA in this or that place. So I don't really know because, again, the credential was not about politics. It was about getting the story right.
Now, I assume most of us, or many of us, watched the hearings, but can you summarize the key finding or the conclusion of the report?
Yeah, I mean, the report is, the summary in my book and the summary in the report is that this was an intentional multi-part plan led by the then president, now president-elect, to disrupt the joint session and prevent the transfer of power. It started with filing claims of election fraud in courts around the country, all unsuccessful. It moved to pressure on state officials to do recounts or investigations of voter fraud, unsuccessful. The states were certifying their results as victories for President-elect Biden. It then focused on the Justice Department and the Vice President, trying to get them to take actions without basis in law or fact, including asking the Vice President to reject certified slates of electors. None of that worked. And so the very last lever that was pulled as part of this conspiracy was sort of launching this angry mob at the Capitol during the joint session to disrupt it. And it did successfully disrupt the joint session for some hours. Everybody knows what happened there. Thankfully, the session resumed and the election was certified. But it was close to not happening.
So in the book, you describe how the 9/11 Commission, which resulted in a big book at the end in 2004, was probably not the right model for this process. What happened in the 18 years between the two reports?
Yeah, good question. America's different now than it was then. When I was in the process of discussions with the speaker about the Jan 6 committee, I read the 9/11 Commission report. Because as a lawyer, I thought, well, that's the gold standard, right? That's a credible, nonpartisan accounting of what occurred that mattered, that led to recommendations that really changed things and enhanced national security. And the 9/11 Commission issued a written report, 800 and some pages at the end of its work, that was kind of read like a novel. And I thought we'd do the same thing, that we would issue, we'd do this long investigation, we'd issue a written report. But my clients, the members of the select committee, I think wisely and accurately realized that America in 2022 gets information and evaluates information in a much different way than America did in 2003 or whenever the 9/11 Commission came out. They decided early that we needed to tell the story in shorter bursts in a visual way in hearings. And hearings is kind of a misnomer because they weren't hearings in that we were getting information. They were presentations of information we'd already received. And it was intentional to tell the story of that multi-part plan to disrupt the joint session that we found in shorter chunks in a manner that met people where they are, right? That was visual with original clips of information from our interviews and documents blown up and a presentation that was meant to be educational in a way that just a bound volume at the end would not have been.
So when did you decide that you wanted to write this book or a book and tie these two events together?
Not till some time after. I wrote the book in part because I kept thinking about these parallels that I didn't feel like had ever been drawn. And to be honest, the other reason was just cathartic. Like, I don't want to be one of those lawyers who's retired and talking about his glory days of his greatest case. I want to be available for more stuff in my life, and I kind of feel like this was a way to clear some space for that, like getting it all in one place, put it out for whatever value it has, so that I kind of am mentally and emotionally ready for something else, whatever that might be. So it took me a little while to get to that point. So it was sometime in the year or so after I left the committee, slept for a while, rested for a while, that I decided, maybe I should write something down about this. And then it came really quickly. Like, once I decided to do it, a lot of this has been swimming around in my head for a long time, so it wasn't practically that difficult.
So let's talk about some of the parallels between the themes that you spend a lot of time on in the book. To the average observer, it looks a little similar perhaps, but different goals, different objectives maybe, and yet you find several items that are pretty strikingly similar.
Yeah, so there were different events. Charlottesville obviously was an event at which people who disagreed wanted to fight, whereas the Capitol was a one-sided attack on an institution. So they weren't exactly the same, but there are a couple commonalities. The two big factual similarities that are outlined in the book, one is law enforcement failures. We talked a little bit about this before. Neither were intelligence failures. There was ample information available to law enforcement planners in advance of both events suggesting violence. In Charlottesville, it was the Unite the Right racists intended to provoke a violent response. They wanted to sort of wrap themselves in this mantle of free speech. We're just here to exercise our First Amendment rights. But when you march through the streets chanting, Jews will not replace us, wearing helmets and shields, you're there to provoke a violent response. And that's exactly what happened. That was really obvious from all the open source intel in advance, yet planners didn't operationalize it. Similarly with the Capitol, there was no mystery that the building and the Capitol and the joint session was the target, and that a lot of the enmity was going to potentially manifest in violence, and planners knew that, yet didn't prepare. And in the book, I go through reasons for that. Information isn't shared very effectively among our law enforcement agencies. We have lots and lots of different agencies that are focused on these issues, but they don't always communicate. Be shocked at what the Metropolitan Police knew, the Capitol Police didn't know, and the FBI didn't know. And the same thing in Charlottesville, like the state police and the Charlottesville police and the FBI, they just we still collectively in this country don't do a good enough job aggregating information. The FBI, in my view, puts really stringent and beyond the requirements of law restrictions on its ability to do anything with information that they obtain through open sources. They have a sordid, terrible history of violating civil liberties. So they put restrictions on their ability to do anything with stuff that they see online. So unless it is sufficiently specific and credible to open a preliminary investigation, this is all FBI speak and the DIOG, the Domestic Intelligence Operations Guide, they can't do anything with it. So if somebody posts a picture of himself with a long gun and says, Jan 6 is like 1776, see you in Washington, they don't do anything with that. It doesn't get aggregated. They don't go knock on the door because that's protected speech. It's not
Should they?
I think they should. This is something that a lot of people disagree with me about, but I think the Bureau needs to turn the dial a little bit more toward leaning forward with strictly open source. And I got to be careful about seeming to intimidate free expression. I totally get that, and there have to be guardrails on this, but I think that they are overly cautious in their restrictions on their ability to do anything with that information. And then the last thing is race. I feel like the essence of policing is the assessment of danger, whether it's an officer making a decision to stop a vehicle because of a perceived violation of law or threat, or agencies evaluating intelligence. It's assessment of danger. And that's infected with our subjective biases about race. Because these were middle-aged white guys in Charlottesville and Jan 6, it's kind of a passive response with bike racks and men and women in shirt sleeves. And if you contrast that to like the summer of 2020 and the George Floyd murder and the protests there, where you had, officers in riot gear and Humvees, it's hard not to ascribe some implicit bias. I say implicit because I didn't find in either Charlottesville or January 6th any evidence of explicit bias or sympathy to the rioters or to the protesters. But again, when it comes to that subjective assessment of danger, I think race matters, and we ought to flag and talk about that. So that whole suite of law enforcement issues is one of the real commonalities. And the other has to do with how Americans get their information now. And this is the whole sort of social media ecosystem. I was very surprised in both Charlottesville and Jan 6 to learn from people where they learned about the things that motivated them to participate in these events. The best example of this is a man named Stephen Ayers, who was a witness for the committee in one of the Jan 6 hearings. Stephen was a carpenter in Erie, Pennsylvania, Trump supporter. He was surprised when the president lost the election, so he started reading about it on Facebook. And every time he read an article on Facebook, his feed then pushed him another article that was designed by an algorithm, a scientific process, to keep him engaged on the platform. Like that's the goal. These are corporations. That's their goal, is to keep people engaged. So Ayers consistently was reading stuff that was pulling him further and further into this world of misinformation, of election fraud. And then he gets connected to an affinity group of other people through Facebook that were frustrated at the election result. He ends up going to Washington, to the Ellipse, for what he thought would be the last Trump rally. And then he marches down the street to the Capitol. Now he's no victim. I don't mean to paint Stephen and men and women like him as victims, because they made a decision to only process that information and not think critically about it. But that increasingly, Ian, is how so many people in this country are getting their information. They're getting it through these curated, algorithm-driven platforms that reinforce their original views. So we live in these silos, and there's not a lot of content moderation or pulling down of stuff that's
It's about to be even less, I think.
I think we have recently seen Meta in particular, yes, explicitly say it's not our job to sift information. And it isn't legally their job. These platforms are not news organizations. They're not held to the same standard as the New York Times, where if the New York Times prints something that's clearly wrong, they can be sued for slander, libel, defamation. Social media platforms under Section 230 of the Communications Act of 1996 are explicitly protected from that. They are just bulletin boards, and it's the users who are providing the content. So the social media ecosystem that led people to these sort of racist affiliations where hateful ideology spread, and they connected with each other. And Jan 6, where a lot of the election fraud stuff, the way in which so many people get information was really eye-opening and is a commonality between the two events.
So law enforcement failure, racial bias, social media. You also identify something else, which is this, you call it the metastasis from a narrow issue of protest to a broader protest about institutions more broadly.
Yeah, so the final commonality between these two events that's in the book is that they each started with a core issue impetus, but pretty quickly metastasized into broader forums of anger at institutions. So Charlottesville, as you all know, started with a discussion about Civil War statues. Should we pull down these statues, which are offensive to some significant portion of our community, or are they recognitions of history and should stay up? Beyond Unite the Right ultimately was way beyond statues. It became about the Great Replacement theory and government that favors people of color over white men and women, and Christian nationalism, and the symbols and the different groups. I mean, it was explicitly meant to unite a lot of different perspectives, but all united in anger at the state of government in Charlottesville and more broadly. Same thing at January 6th. It started, a lot of people were there initially because of their belief that the election had been stolen, their false belief. But there are a lot of people there that were angry about COVID restrictions. And a lot of people who were there who were also in Charlottesville, who were mad at the same things about this perception that our government and our institutions are favoring people at their expense. So that showed me that, to me, the core divide in this country is no longer one of right versus left, but rather insiders versus outsiders. People that believe in, endorse, trust institutions, government, media, higher education, even science, and people that just don't think those systems work for them. There's a lot of cynicism, and this is across the political spectrum. This is the far right MAGA base and the far left, Democratic Socialist, Bernie Sanders, anti-capitalist. Like, there's a lot of people that just don't think that the system, right, works for them. And that to me is the fundamental divide that is revealed by what I learned in Charlottesville and at the Capitol.
You have a powerful quote about this on page 144. Charlottesville and January 6 reveal that the true division in this country is no longer political, but rather cultural. Americans are less motivated by political ideology than by their faith or lack thereof in institutions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think while both Charlottesville and Jan 6 represent one reaction to that cynicism, and that's anger, people got so mad at institutions that they were willing to engage in acts of violence against each other or against law enforcement. But the other reaction that I identify in the book, and the one that I think is ultimately more dangerous, is apathy. Because I think a lot of people who feel that cynicism, who don't think that those institutions work for them, they don't get mad and charge the Capitol. They just sit on the couch and they throw up their hands and they say, you know what, it doesn't really matter if I vote, it doesn't really matter if I educate myself, if I participate in civic life, because they're all the same and those systems don't work for me, so I'm just going to do my thing and disengage. That, to me, is more dangerous long-term than anger. We can work with anger, we can work against it, we can compartmentalize it, we can repel it, but apathy is much harder to do. So the book is meant to call out not just the anger that those events reveal, but to try to discourage that apathy, because democracy really comes down to people of good faith doing the right thing. And if those people go home or stay home, then we're doomed.
And you give some Hello. You give some concrete examples of things to do. We're going to come back to that in a minute, but here we are, January 16th. In about 100 hours, we will have a new president who played a starring role on January 6th and has characterized the events of that day very differently than you have, and most objective observers have. I'd love to hear your thoughts about the presidential election and how that shapes your thoughts on the work you did.
So I think it's a mistake to assume that that the election results are a repudiation of our findings or are an affirmation of what the president did on January 6th. I think it's really hard to ascribe one unified motivation as to why President Trump was reelected. I think it's a lot of things. I do think it has a lot to do with this cynicism about institutions. I think it was a protest vote. In some ways, it was a vote against elites in the deep state and the system as much as it was a vote for President Trump. I think a lot of people don't agree with him in terms of character and think that his actions on January 6th were wrong, but they voted for him anyway because, again, they want somebody who's going to change the system, who's going to disrupt things that they don't think work. So I don't feel as if the election diminishes our work or repudiates it. I always felt throughout the investigation, Ian, that the audience ultimately was longer term, that while we were doing those hearings, obviously to educate people and influence public opinion in the short term, I was mindful all along that what we were doing would be a historical record, like the 9/11 Commission report, and that lessons learned over time will matter and will make democracy stronger and will make everything from short term, like the Capitol being more secure, the Electoral Count Act being reformed, some of the granular things that changed. But it's important for us to understand history. It's appropriate that we're at the Historical Society. It's important to understand history so that you don't repeat its mistakes. And I always felt like we're speaking here to a legacy audience, not just a short-term audience. And I'm still proud of that work. I feel like it will stand the test of time factually, and that it will hopefully help people understand and prevent future problems.
Let's stay there for a second about the historical implications of both January 6th, Unite the Right, but also this broader period in our democracy. How do you situate this as you look back at the arc of U.S. and world history?
Yeah, that's part of what gives me hope, frankly, is we've been divided before. Like I hear people on television talk about, this sort of unprecedented level of division in our country. And I'm like, really? Like, remember the 1960s? You remember like political leaders being assassinated? You remember the freaking Civil War? Like we've had spasms in our history of extreme division, yet we have endured because democracy comes down to people. Again, good people of good faith have stepped forward. So I don't want to minimize the danger because it's real, but I also feel like the raw material is there and historically has proven resilient for us to continue this experiment in democracy in a way that works. So I think we are going to get through it. I think it's going to be a little bit of a rough ride for 4 years. I think a lot of things will happen that will require that engagement, will require that attention, will require that involvement. That's my hope that that the things that occur prompt a more powerful response. Dr. King and Barack Obama say, the arc of history is long and it bends toward justice. It may be jagged, it may go back and forth.
You got to pull at it.
You got to pull at it. But I think that's right. I think if things are outrageous, if there are mass deportations or if there is threat to a woman's right to choose, for example, that's going to get people exercised in participatory in democracy, and that could have a more powerful, long-lasting impact. That's the benign, hope. But I think the raw material, as I said, is there for that.
Great. Well, we're going to collect the index cards so I can ask any audience questions that there may be. But before I get to those cards, you do give them some examples of what we can do if we care about the democracy. You have it's also an action plan in the book.
Yeah. I meant to have the last part of the book be, I don't want to say a primer, but some practical things that people can do. The first is to try to do something, and that can be as simple as not making a lot of assumptions about people that disagree with you. I think too many people in America not only disagree with others, but assume that somebody with whom they disagree is evil or has nothing that I can reach or has nothing to say from which I can learn. So my first piece of advice is to have hard conversations and not assume the worst in people with whom you disagree. Go there instead of step away. And that can be hard and it may not be successful. I had somebody at a book event ask me, well, how do I implement that as a transgender woman when I'm talking to someone who just questions my right to exist? I said, it's a fair question, and I'm not suggesting everybody to whom you open your mind and have a conversation, you're going to end up hugging and finding common ground. But you got to at least be amenable to trying. I also think we got to show up in the world in a way that is mindful of the ways in which we get information and educate ourselves. I have to remind myself to do this. I live in a liberal college town. Most of my friends are liberal Democrats, academics, and lawyers, and I read the New York Times and I listen to NPR. I got to constantly kind of remind myself, hey, I got to get out of my own echo chamber and try to have contact with or learn from sources that are different from mine. And I'm really attracted, as a matter of policy, to finding more ways to encourage shared experience. I really like the idea, for example, of some kind of national service program. I wouldn't make it mandatory, but I would strongly incentivize opportunities for young people to build trails or work in nursing homes or have some sort of civilian service so that people of different backgrounds can actually kind of walk together in a common cause and not have them not pay taxes for 3 years or something so that there's a benefit. We need to find ways in our own world to identify opportunities for shared experience, whether it's our neighborhood or our church or our school or our workplace. And then again, the last thing, I think, the most practical advice it bears repeating, which is, resist the temptation to tune out, resist the understandable reaction to the crazy that we see in Washington and in Richmond, and say, you know what, I'm just going to do my thing and not care. We got to care. We really do, because government does matter, and those institutions, in order for them to be strong, have to be the product of people paying attention, holding them accountable, and doing what they need to do to protect democracy.
And while he comes up here, and what about social media? Anything we can do about that?
I don't blame the platforms, candidly, for this. The platforms are businesses that their job is to maximize profit for shareholders. So I think instead of demonizing them, we got to be smarter consumers. This really should start with young people. Like, I know my own kids just have grown up in a different landscape with the world in their pocket, literally. And we got to help them navigate that. I just read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, and he says, we've become, as parents, so protective of our kids' physical safety that we don't let them walk down the block to the grocery store because they could get kidnapped. But we turn them loose on the internet where there are all kinds of crazy threats. I think that's right. Like, we need to teach our children how to navigate that landscape, critical thinking skills, how to sift that information, what the algorithms do, and how to listen to each other constructively, how to show up in conversations with people who are different, give them the skill set, to do that. So a lot of this really could be applied to the youngest members of the community.
Well, that's one of the questions here. One of our participants observes that there are almost no young people here.
Yeah.
And have you experienced young people paying attention to these issues?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I have to say, I don't know the answer to it. Most of the invitations I get, and most of the people that watch the TV shows on which I appear, are kind of like this audience.
It's a great audience.
It's a great audience. Love you, yes, but good question. I do think that we do have to find ways to meet kids where they are. So maybe we should use some of these same platforms on which they're so focused as mechanisms to deliver some of this content. Because unless we start with them, then a bunch of us who agree it isn't going to matter. So no, I wish I had a better answer to that. I have not found a lot of interest in the ideas in the book or in our work from audiences of younger folks.
We have another question here. We're running out of time, both in the event and in the well, you'll get it when I get the question. Do you think you need a presidential pardon for your work with the Select Committee?
Emphatically, no. Not interested in a pardon. And I've thought about this before. I do have a lawyer who's prepared to help me respond to inquiries. I won't be surprised if there are questions asked, if congressional committees or even FBI agents or grand juries want to investigate the work that we did on the committee. But I still think in America it takes actual facts to have real exposure, like actual culpability. And those facts just aren't present here. So I don't want a pardon because I haven't done anything that's remotely close to culpable. I do expect some level of inconvenience, disruption, which is meant to be intimidating. But that almost sort of, I don't know, emboldens me even more. So I don't want it to be excused from it. I want to engage with it.
Great. Maybe you can talk a minute about the process of writing this book, your method. I know you did use a Batten School research assistant, but tell us more about the process.
Yeah, so it started with an outline of, here's my sort of arc of the story that I presented to my publisher, Steerforth Press. They said, sounds great. Can you have it in 6 months? And I said, I'll try, because I have a regular job and a family and other things going on. So I kind of was on a disciplined schedule of writing 2 chapters a month for 6 months. It started in January of 24, and my manuscript deadline was June 30th. And a lot of this was in my head. I didn't have to do a lot of original thinking. It was just ordering these things that I had thought about. I had a researcher, a woman named Nora Noose, who used to be a local reporter here, then went to work for Anderson Cooper, Batten graduate, and she was my researcher. So I would sort of write the draft chapters with a few places where I needed her to fill some things in. Like, I know that Pat Cipollone said something like this in our interview, can you find it? And she would find the site. Or can you find examples of academic programs that bring conservatives and liberal college students together for constructive discussion? And she had 3 examples. So she was incredible and invaluable. And then the piece of advice I got from the publisher as I was submitting chapters was, look, the thread through the book is you, Tim, your personal experience with these issues. Like, don't let this just be a bunch of facts about what happened. Put in stuff about your own learning, your own surprises, your own experience. So I started to add more stuff from my own life, like a couple of stories about when I was a prosecutor and something about the Fountain Fund that Phyllis mentioned, this nonprofit with which I'm involved. So I put more and more of myself and my own lived experience into the book in an attempt to kind of pull together the facts and the high-minded principles through the eyes of the writer.
Great. This is probably the last question. One of our participants here talks about their own experience witnessing declines in democracy, and said the events in Charlottesville and later in the Capitol Hill were painfully familiar, and there's an overall sense of doom and inevitable decline of democracy that's palpable. Do you truly believe that we stand a chance in preventing further violence and the ultimate break of state and rise of democracy, a rise of a dictator? And I will note that you did name this book Harbingers, plural. Give us some hope.
Yeah. I definitely have hope. Yes, I appreciate the question, because it's easy in the moment to say, you throw your hands up again and say, oh man, we're screwed because we elected this person that doesn't have the same definition of democracy as we. I think that people in this country are fundamentally good and decent, whoever they voted for, and that good faith and our commonality will endure. It will take vigilance, and it will take people not withdrawing. But yeah, I feel like we're going to be okay. I don't mean to suggest that everything is okay. That I do think there will be times over the coming years that present challenges to democracy, that lean toward autocracy. But if well-intentioned people react to that in lots of ways, everything from protest, which definitely matters, making your voice heard, to educating yourself about the issue so that you're informed and can have an influence on the people around you, to then voting in 2 years and in 4 years thereafter. I really do think that the backlash to the crazy could end up being more more powerful. So I do have hope myself. I absolutely do. Despite immersion in these horrific events, we're capable of some really dark things, we as a people, but we're also capable of pretty amazing things when we pull together. And I hope that people read the book and take it as kind of a call to that, or a call to care, a call to engage, and a call to our higher, better angels than what we're witnessing sometimes day to day in our current government.
Well, history matters, Tim, and you've made an important contribution to it. Please join me in thanking Tim Heaphy.
Thank you. Hey, thank you. Just before we go, I just wanted to say a couple things. I will be happy to stay as long as possible and sign anybody's book, but I just wanted to thank you, Ian, for your thoughtful questions, and the Historical Society for inviting me. I like talking about this stuff. I think it's important to talk about this stuff, and talking about it here in Charlottesville, half a mile from where I live, with people that really experience this in real time, is a great and exciting opportunity for me. So thank you for the invitation, Tom. I really appreciate it.